I remember when GraphQL came out quite a few years ago, and we looked at it and we were like, meh, this is never going to pick up. And we were wrong. Hasura is a open source service that gives you instant real-time GraphQL APIs with authorization baked in that works with any authentication service for your new or existing database. Today we do it with Postgres. Eventually we'll have other databases supported as well. So what we do is we generate CRUD and real-time APIs on top of a database automatically. We do that for Postgres right now. We'll eventually do it for other databases as well. And then as a product, we also kind of do automated schema stitching to help you kind of add custom resolvers, more GraphQL, your own GraphQL APIs. We also do eventing on the database so that you can kind of attach serverless functions to changes in your database. So that's on the backend side. Now, if you're using Hasura to build an app, you'll be consuming these APIs on your app using GraphQL, right? And the biggest benefit of GraphQL for our users is that, and this is the kind of the most important thing, is that as another product that's kind of publishing APIs, right? It's very hard as an application developer to use a new product that provides its own API spec, because I need to go to some documentation, look at it, figure out, oh, this is how the API works, this is the kind of format of the API, this is how I pass arguments, this is how I get responses, this is how errors are handled. And so I need to read up a lot. I need to invest a lot of time and effort into understanding how a particular API works, what the kind of the design of the API is before I can start using it in my app effectively, right? Just think about any kind of API that you've ever integrated with, any solution that you've integrated with on your app. And that entire problem goes away just by having GraphQL. There's emerging technology today, especially with what we're doing, where you get a GraphQL API automatically, with authorization and access control baked in on top of a database. So what this now allows people to do is to say, all right, so we have these REST APIs, they exist, let's not touch them, but let's add this kind of GraphQL API here on top of our existing database. And that way our applications can start using GraphQL, especially for the read stuff or the real-time stuff where stuff is changing on the back end and they want to consume that on the front end. And that actually can happen automatically. REST was designed or optimized for the backend developer experience. And if you look at what's happened in the last 10 years, we've been moving away from doing stuff on the backend to doing stuff on the front end, right? And you see React and you see Angular, you see Vue, you see all of this like amazing amount of work that's happening on the front end to build richer experiences, to build richer front end applications. And when that's happening, over the last few years, people started realizing that the API experience is broken for front-end developers, right? Like, we don't enjoy using these APIs. But kind of fast forward to where we are today, we suddenly have an experience that was shamelessly designed to be optimized for front-end developers, right? And that's GraphQL. And GraphQL suddenly makes front-end developers feel like they would totally enjoy working with the backend. Like, I would like to integrate with this API because the experience of using this API, writing my front-end code gen, auto-completion is amazing. And so I actually now want to use APIs instead of just always treating APIs as something that is a last-minute thing and there's this ugly thing that I don't want to touch. The description of the benefits of GraphQL tends to be in the abstract, right? And if you're listening into all the hype and that's kind of encouraging you to try GraphQL, that's great. But in my mind, and the key benefits that I have seen that are immediate and super helpful to companies, the first thing is that GraphQL is the best gift that you can give to your front-end team, right? If you're thinking about making your front-end team happy, and if you're thinking about making them productive, move to GraphQL yesterday. And that's the, forget the why and the how that works, but you just have this guarantee that the instant you change your API to become a GraphQL API, the existing community tooling, the way GraphQL itself is a massive boost to the productivity of your front-end team. And this comes in through two reasons, right? One is that GraphQL as an API solves that essential problem of building a backend for front end, of doing overfetching and underfetching and stuff that you'd hear about when you can make one API call instead of making 10 API calls. But the other huge benefit that GraphQL has is that it solves this politics problem that you have in any organization where you have front-end teams and back-end teams, and you're kind of trying to separate the ownership where you say, hey, front-end team, go ahead, build your application, be massively productive, get a lot of users for us. These are your KPIs and goals for the product that you're building. And then you go to your back-end team and you say, hey, back-end team, keep the systems up and running, make the APIs fast, keep it secure. These are your KPIs and goals for the product that we're building, right? And when you kind of try to separate out the ownership between these two teams, you'll realize that there's this huge problem that you don't really, maybe you account for it as the product evolves, but there's this communication problem that you have between the back-end team and the front-end team, right? And this is a bottleneck. This is horrible, right? You need to every time the front-end team wants to get a more efficient API, instead of making 5 API calls, you need to contact the back-end team. The back-end team may or may not give you a new API endpoint by the time you need your app to be released. Maybe you don't want to wait for them, so you actually end up making 5 API calls. The documentation is always out of date. You're expecting a Boolean, but you get a string with TRUE as a string instead of getting a Boolean. The API documentation is out of sync. There's all kinds of crazy stuff that can happen, and that communication problem essentially gets solved because of the way GraphQL is. The other huge benefit, and this is something that we didn't have when we had our own JSON APIs and we hadn't adopted GraphQL, was that we have a lot of internal technology that we've built out for doing real-time GraphQL well, right? Which means that you can handle, you can get events on what has changed on the database, and these will be reliable. You won't drop events. You will get information. You can subscribe to a live kind of result set. So if you have a particular query and something about this query changes on the database or changes inside the data model, you will get the refreshed result automatically on the client. Now this is a nice capability to have, but to actually integrate this capability is a gigantic pain, right? Because if you think about integrating real-time functionalities into your app, like you either use something like polling or long polling, which is just disgusting, which doesn't feel good. Like a lot of the times you can get away with just polling, right? But when you actually start using and you start setting up polling threads in your app, especially if you're writing JavaScript, like you create like a set interval and then you start polling stuff, and then you have to clean up the pollers, and let's say you have multiple real-time reactive features in your app, it's a pain. The other alternative is to use WebSockets on the client, which is a nightmare, right? It's like polling is gross and WebSockets is a nightmare. So you're kind of between a rock and a hard place with that. So when you look at WebSockets, setting up WebSockets on the client, handling WebSockets, reconnecting with WebSockets, sending authorization headers over WebSockets, it's a pain. What GraphQL allows you to do is standardize the way you will publish events and live result sets to the client. And this makes it extremely easy for our users to integrate real-time features into their applications, right? And what GraphQL has essentially allowed us to do is to give developers the kind of BAS-like experience that they would have gotten with a Firebase or a Parse that they would love. But you get that on top of your own existing database, your new database that you're running on-prem, you're running on the cloud, which is what your team wants, right? But as an application developer, you want that amazing experience of like being able to query for what data you want, using real-time stuff, using reactive stuff, and that's been phenomenal for our users, right? That's been absolutely amazing. So we have to maintain less documentation about our APIs because GraphQL by its nature is self-documenting. It makes it easy for us to add new features to our APIs. And I think we've made 40 releases to our API over the last 6 months or the last 7 months. And it's been seamless. Like we've had users who've been in production from the first month that we launched our open source project to new users going into production today. And they're all on a spectrum of the different versions that we've released, and they've all have had this seamless upgrade process moving from one API version to the other because of the way that you publish your API with GraphQL and the way you handle versioning with GraphQL. is that you essentially don't do versioning with GraphQL. You do additive changes with GraphQL, and you don't make destructive changes with GraphQL. What we do when we're building a GraphQL backend is that when we get a GraphQL query, we compile that to a single SQL query. And so no matter kind of how deep or large the GraphQL query that the GraphQL query that comes in from the client, it still converts to a single database call. If you're fetching related stuff from other GraphQL schemas, I'm sure that's other calls to other GraphQL servers. But to the database itself, it's one hit, right? And that makes the experience amazing for our users, because that's faster than the REST APIs that they'd come to kind of see, right? They're like, what? This is just like, I click on this and I get the response here. Is this local? Is this working locally, or is this actually running remotely on a server, right? So, and that's really fun to watch when people kind of try out that experience with GraphQL. There are a bunch of ways to kind of transition to GraphQL. I think a lot of that depends on how large your product is and what the ownership structure of the organization or the team that's building the product is. So one is the kind of most typical use case. You have a microservices backend, you have a front-end team, you have a back-end team. Back-end team is maintaining, and the back-end team is like various teams. So you have lots of like different APIs that are being maintained by different services or by different teams. And then you have a front-end application, a front-end team that consumes these various APIs. A very typical next step for a team that's structured like this is to kind of start building a backend for front-end API, which kind of aggregates their various REST APIs into a single API endpoint, and then provide that to the client. So GraphQL is usually a really good segue for these teams to take. And what they do often is that they kind of start building this GraphQL gateway or a wrapper that kind of wraps together these microservices for the front-end team. There are a bunch of different ways to go about the gateway itself, right? So for example, in this extreme case, you have each microservice team builds its own GraphQL wrapper service that kind of accurately represents their own microservice API. So they convert their REST API into what is the most kind of beautiful GraphQL API for their microservice. And so you have a bunch of GraphQL services. And then you have this other kind of GraphQL gateway that's stitching together these GraphQL services. And that's this, like, you've added 2 more layers to your work from where it was before. The other way in a lot of cases is that the front-end team has taken up ownership and said, we want a nice GraphQL gateway, we want a single endpoint, we don't want to make multiple API calls. And so they actually end up taking ownership and building this GraphQL gateway service. And that's typically with like a Node.js kind of GraphQL gateway service. And the front-end team takes this ownership. They build this service. They build out their GraphQL schema that forwards or proxies to the upstream microservices. And the ownership is actually with the front-end team. This is also a fairly common approach. And then there's approaches in the middle where you have a platform team internal to your organization that's helping like get these multiple stakeholders and multiple teams together. So they often take up the ownership of building a nice GraphQL gateway that talks to your microservices.